To tonight's guest, the former Prime Minister Paul Keating is here in our Sydney studio. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Tony.
Now, early in 2009, as I said at the beginning of the show, you warned the global financial crisis was a catastrophe way worse than it appears. Has that assessment been borne out?
Oh, I think so. In early '09, it wasn't apparent that it was as large as it was and would linger as long. And of course, it is large and it is lingering. We're getting these second-round effects now in Europe. And yet we still have the big impact in the United States. You know, output is down, demand is down, the government stimulus is starting to be wound back, the private demand has not picked up, 10% of people are out of work. You know, it's pretty bad.
Yeah, you also warned that if the crisis went on for a few more years, there was a serious risk of default by the US Treasury. Is it still... does that risk still exist? Because the US Treasury seems to be printing money now to sort of stave off that problem.
Well, I think at that time, 2 years ago, I was talking about the prospective US deficits, which had not been focused upon then. They are well focused upon now. And of course, if the American budget debt trajectory is unattended to, of course, it would be unfundable in the long run. I think the Americans will attend to it. But in the meantime, dealing with the underlying influences, you know, where they go on revenue, where they go on spending, because when you've got 10% of people out of work, unemployment benefits are up, the tax receipts are down, the deficit widens. So the big issue for the United States is growth. Getting back to growth.
We've already had near defaults in Ireland and Greece, only staved off by giant rescue packages from the IMF and the EU. Spain and Portugal remain in serious trouble. Fracture lines are appearing in Europe between those countries that are doing reasonably well and those countries heading towards disaster, and the euro's in serious trouble. So I'm wondering how you see the coming year.
Yeah, well, this is a big problem. In a single currency, I mean, the game in Europe in the old days was you had the Deutschmark and you had the countries of Europe appreciating and depreciating against it as their economic conditions dictated. In a one-size-fits-all monetary regime with a single currency, those competitive depreciations are not available to countries. So what they're now getting credit shocks. It's a bit like the Australian economy before the float of the exchange rate here. When the exchange rate was rigid and you had an external shock, the shock went through interest rates and through credits. You remember the phrase, the period of Australian history called the credit squeeze. Well, the credit squeeze came because of the incapacity of the exchange rate to adjust. This is what these smaller peripheral countries have now got in Europe, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. And so what's happened, they say, well, how do we improve our competitiveness? Well, if they lower prices, including property prices, this makes the credit crunch worse. The banks have got less value on their books, asset prices are falling, yet they have to fall to be competitive. You see what I mean? So they've got this terrible bind. Can the European Union, can the Union carry on? I've always tended to think it would, but I'm now having doubts that it might. That is, and we've had the bare transfer of bank debt to public debt, classically in Ireland. I noticed the journalist from the Financial Times say the other day, in the case of the banks in Ireland, they are not too big to fail, but they're too big to save, because essentially the presumption is bank debt is public debt. And so a whole country and a whole community are going to be impoverished essentially by the transfer of bank debt into public debt. And so the question is, what do you save first? Will you save the state? Ireland probably definitely shouldn't have taken on the bank debt. In other words, they should be letting bondholders take the haircut. There's got to be losses without bringing sovereign risk into question. So the sovereign risk of Ireland, the sovereign capacity of Ireland is now in question because it's picked up the bank debt. So where do they go? Well, they may have to leave the Union. I mean, which of course their exchange rates will drop. There'll be an attendant increase in interest rates. All this means it's going to be pretty ordinary in Europe for quite a while. Yet the German economy has been going very strongly. It's been selling things to the rest of Europe, but not
The
much.
big question will be whether they commit themselves permanently to the European Union experiment, or whether at some point they start to get dragged down by it and want to pull loose.
See, normally if you had, as you do in Australia, a single currency, which affects Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia, we have horizontal fiscal transfers occur within this country. But horizontal fiscal transfers do not occur in Europe. In other words, the idea that German and French taxpayers bail out Irish and Portuguese taxpayers is not part and parcel of that, and banks are not regulated on a pan-European basis. You know the old saying about banks? They grow abroad but die at home. They all die at home. So now the presumption is on the part of many bankers that the debt is not, the hit is not taken by the shareholders and the bondholders, but the hit is taken by the budget and therefore the taxpayers. It's pretty tough.
Yeah, let's move closer to home. And where do you see China fitting in to this big picture, and how reliant is the rest of the world on the Chinese economy now, particularly Australia and the United States?
Well, it's reliant a lot. I mean, China's 6 trillion of GDP, 6,000 billion, it's growing at 10%, roughly. So that's 600 billion of new wealth. The United States is what, 16 trillion, is growing at 2? That's 320 of new wealth. So China's contribution of new wealth to the world economy is twice that of the United States. So that's how important it is.
Is there, as a result of these kind of changes, are we seeing a permanent shift in the balance of global power?
Well, we're certainly seeing a permanent shift in economic power. That is, you know, someone said recently, before the Industrial Revolution, the value of most people's work across the world was the same. Therefore, the economies which had the biggest number of people, the biggest populations, would have had the biggest GDP. This is why China was the biggest economy in the world before 1800. Very quickly, in the Industrial Revolution, a small country like Britain started to outproduce a place like China. We've now got a world equalisation of productivity. So that means that the people, again, with the biggest populations will have the biggest economies. So China and India will have, in time, the largest two economies in the world. First it'll be China overtaking the United States, and then you'll have India as well. So if we look at the world economy in the next, maybe in 2050, the first biggest economy will be the United States, will be China, the second will be the United States, the third will be India, the fourth, a long way down, would probably be Japan, then 5, 6 and 7. So the answer is yes, there's going to be a huge shift in the balance of world economic power, and that, of course, normally occasions a shift in strategic power.
Well, it has strategic implications as well as economic ones, and I know that you're actually concerned about this and what happens when China, or if China, starts to feel hemmed in by strategic adversaries.
Yeah. Well, you might remember, Tony, I put together with Bill Clinton the APEC leaders meeting in 1992. That was 18 years ago, because I could see China coming in a sense then, and the key thing was to have a structure to receive it in. In other words, I thought it was important that we do not do to China what Russia, Britain and France did to Germany at the end of the 19th century. Essentially, they cavilled at Bismarck's creation, and that sort of view of illegitimacy played its role in bringing on the First World War and, of course, the Second World War. So we had 2 world wars over the status of Germany, and I never believed we should have a 3rd world war over the status of China.
Do you think that's, I mean, is that a genuine possibility? And are you talking about a kind of Chinese version of living space, or Lebensraum, as the Germans call it?
I think no. I don't think it's likely to happen, because China, you know, has joined the World Trade Organization, it's part of the G7, but China will need some strategic space. Just like all great rising powers are always feared, great powers demand some strategic space. So the United States made a huge mistake with Russia at the end of the Cold War. There's Gorbachev magnanimously agreeing to a united Germany and NATO. 6 years later, the United States has Hungary, Poland and the Czech Republic in NATO up to the Russian border. President Obama is now seeking to change that, to give the Russians a better stake in the game. Well, what we do for the Russians, which I certainly approve of, we have to do for the Chinese. That is, China I don't think is an expansionist power, but it is a great power. I mean, we've had this sort of unusual situation in the world for 60 years where the second economic power in the world has been a strategic client of the first economic power. This has never happened in history. This is Japan and the United States. Well, the second economic power in the world today, China, will definitely not be a strategic client of the first economic power, the United States. So we're going to have a change in the world. We're going to go back to the world the way it used to be. The world is fundamentally anarchic. It was anarchic, is anarchic. The peace we've had for 60 or 70 years has been highly unusual, 65 years. So we're going to be in a more complex, trickier world, but a better world.